She was 24 years old and had never once been chosen. Not for a dance at the harvest social, not for a seat beside someone at Sunday supper, not for anything that required a man to look at her and decide she was worth the trouble. Clara Ashcombe had learned to stop waiting to be chosen. She baked instead. She kneaded dough at 4 in the morning when the loneliness got loud. She built a clay oven with her own 2 hands when no one offered to help. And when the most respected rancher in Holt County bit into one of her loaves and went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with manners, everything in her carefully ordered life cracked straight down the middle. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with me until the end. Like this video and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The sod house sat low against a Nebraska hillside like it had always been part of the earth. Half swallowed by it, really. The walls were packed dirt reinforced with straw, the roof a thick mat of grass that grew right through the summer and turned gray in October. From the county road, if you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely. Most people did. Clara Ashcombe had lived there alone for 2 years, since her father passed in the spring of 1882 and left her the quarter section, a broken-down mule named Pocket, and a list of debts that she'd spent 14 months paying off. The debts were cleared now. The mule was still broken down. And the house, well, the house was hers, which meant something even when it didn't look like much. What the house had that no one expected was an oven. She'd built it herself the first autumn, after the store-bought stove threw a crack and she couldn't afford the repair. She'd read everything she could find about clay construction, asked questions at the general store in Harwick until the owner stopped pretending to look busy when she came in, and then she'd spent 3 weeks shaping and firing and testing until she got it right. The oven sat in the northeast corner of the main room, smooth and domed, radiating heat that seeped into the walls and made the whole house feel warmer than it had any right to be. She'd plastered the surround with river clay and pressed small stones into the pattern in a way that was purely decorative, purely her own. Nobody had ever commented on it. She baked bread every Tuesday and Friday without fail. She loaded the loaves into a flat-bottomed wagon on Wednesday and Saturday mornings and drove the 4 miles into Harwick, where she sold them out of the wagon bed in front of Tillman's Feed and Grain. She charged 12 cents a loaf. People bought them quickly. Several women had told her, sincerely, that it was the best bread in 3 counties. What those same women had never done was invite her to anything. Clara was not oblivious. She understood exactly what the hesitation was. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders, full through the hips, with hands that looked like they belonged to someone who worked outdoors because they did. She wasn't built the way the women in the ladies' magazines were built, wasn't small and neat and arranged in the way that seemed to make men comfortable. She'd grown up hearing the word sturdy used to describe her, always in a tone that meant something other than what the word actually said. She'd heard other words too, in schoolyards and at socials, and once, memorably, from a boy at a barn dance when she was 16, loud enough that 3 people turned to look. She'd stopped going to barn dances after that. What she'd decided, somewhere in the long quiet of those 2 years alone, was that this was just the shape of her life. She had the land. She had the oven. She had enough income from the bread to stay warm and fed through winter. It wasn't everything she'd imagined at 15, lying on her back in the grass counting stars. But it was a life she'd built with her own hands, and there was dignity in that, even when nobody else seemed to see it. The morning everything shifted was a Saturday in early September, 1883. She'd brought 11 loaves to Harwick. It was a cool morning, the first real hint of fall in the air, and there was a light that made the prairie look almost gentle, pale gold over the long grass, the sky that deep particular blue that only lasted about 3 weeks in Nebraska before it went gray for 6 months. She'd parked the wagon in the usual spot and lifted the canvas off the loaves, and she was straightening them in the bed when she heard voices behind her. Stopped at the Clearwater place, and they said to ask at the grain store. Well, the grain store sent me here. A pause. That's a good smell. She turned around. There were 2 men, both on horseback, both dusty from the road in the way that meant they'd been riding since early. The one who had spoken last was already dismounting. He was taller than she'd initially gauged from the saddle, broad through the chest, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been outdoors long enough to show it. He looked to be in his mid-30s. He was looking at her bread. "How much?" he said. 12 cents a loaf. He nodded, reached into his coat pocket, and handed her a quarter without looking at the coins first. "I'll take 2. She made change. He took the loaves without breaking them apart, tucked one under his arm, tore an end off the other right there in the street, and ate it standing beside her wagon. She watched him because she couldn't not watch him. There was something almost rude about the focus he brought to it, the way his attention narrowed down to the bread like everything else in the street had stopped existing. He chewed slowly. His expression didn't perform anything. "What's in it?" he said finally. "Flour, water, salt, starter culture I've been keeping for about a year. Little bit of rendered lard in the crust. That's all?" "That's all." He looked at her then. Not the way most men looked at her, which was either a quick evaluation and a look away, or the specific kind of extended attention that was about something else entirely. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at the bread, like he was trying to figure something out. "You made this yourself." "I did." "Where?" She hesitated. "I have a place out on the Callaway Road, about 4 miles east." He nodded. "I came through that way this morning. Didn't see a house." It's set back from the road, into the hillside. His companion, younger, with a red kerchief around his neck, had dismounted and was leaning against a post, watching this exchange with mild entertainment. "Elias," he said, "we were supposed to be at the Denton place by 10. We'll make it." The man, Elias, handed the second loaf to his companion and looked back at Clara. "Do you sell every Saturday?" "Wednesday and Saturday, same spot." He studied her for a moment longer. Not uncomfortable exactly, but deliberate in a way that made her want to look somewhere else. She didn't. "I'll be back Wednesday," he said, and mounted his horse. She watched them ride south out of Harwick and told herself it was nothing. Men bought bread. Men said they'd come back. Half of them didn't. She sold the remaining 9 loaves in the next hour and drove home telling herself exactly that. It was nothing. It didn't mean anything. Stop thinking about it. She thought about it for 4 days. Try it. His name was Elias Rowan. She found that out from Martha Tillman at the grain store, who told her without being asked, because Martha Tillman told everyone everything without being asked. "That's the Rowan from over in Custer County," Martha said, rewrapping a bolt of calico with unnecessary precision. "Runs the double R spread. Big operation. Something like 3,000 head last count. He's not married." She said the last part with the specific weight women used when they wanted you to register the information without appearing to push it. "Bought the Harwick property last spring, I heard. Might be expanding east." "He bought bread," Clara said. "That's all." Martha gave her a look that said, "Sure it is," without saying a word. He came back on Wednesday. He bought 3 loaves, stayed long enough to ask her how the starter culture worked, and left. On Saturday, he came back again with the same companion, whose name turned out to be Del Marsh, and who was Elias's foreman, and Del bought 2 loaves of his own. On the following Wednesday, Elias came alone. That was when things started to feel different. He didn't just buy and leave. He leaned against the side of the wagon and asked questions. Not small talk questions, not the polite noise people made to fill silence, but actual questions. Where had she learned to bake? What happened when a starter culture went bad? How had she built the oven? That last one surprised her enough that she answered before she thought about whether she wanted to. "You built it yourself," he said. "There wasn't anyone else to do it." "How long did it take?" 3 weeks, maybe a little more. I ruined 2 batches of clay before I got the mix right. There's a particular creek bed about a mile from my place that has the right kind of deposit. More silica than the riverbank clay. Fires harder." He was watching her face when she said this. Not her body, not the way some men watched when they thought she wasn't noticing. Just her face. Like what she was saying was the thing he was interested in. "That's not something most people would figure out on their own," he said. "I had to figure it out. It was that or cold bread all winter." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recognition of some kind. "You didn't ask anyone for help?" "I asked questions at the grain store until Tillman started avoiding the counter when I came in." She said it flat, without humor or complaint, just the fact of it. "After that, I worked it out myself." He was quiet for a moment. The street was busy around them. A freight wagon grinding past, 2 women from the Methodist congregation talking in front of the milliners, a dog investigating something under the boardwalk. and none of it seemed to touch the particular stillness of where they were standing. "I'd like to see it sometime," he said. "The oven." She looked at him. "The process interests me," he added, and it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like a man who genuinely meant what he said and wasn't used to having to explain himself. "I'm trying to sort out the provisioning for the East Pasture camps. Feed a lot of hands over a long season. Bread goes faster than you'd think." That was practical. That was a business reason. Clara told herself that was what this was. "Wednesdays and Saturdays," she said. "Here, if you want larger quantities, give me a week's notice." "What if I want to see the operation?" She looked at him again. He wasn't smiling, wasn't pressing, wasn't doing the things some men did when they wanted something and were trying to make it seem like they were doing you a favor by wanting it. He was just asking. "Callaway Road," she said finally. "East 4 miles. You'll see a track running south off the road near a split-trunk cottonwood. Follow it about a quarter mile." He nodded. "Saturday morning, if that's all right." She said it was. She drove home and spent the next 3 days convincing herself this was purely a business inquiry. He arrived Saturday at 8 in the morning, alone, on a bay horse that was well kept without being showy. She was already at the oven when she heard the hoofbeats. She'd been up since 5, 2 batches of bread already resting, a third on its way, and she wiped her hands on her apron and went out to meet him. He pulled up in the yard and took in the place without saying anything. She watched him look at it, the sawed walls, the low roofline with its fringe of dried-out grass, the small kitchen garden on the south side that was just about done for the season, the clay oven visible through the open door, Pocket watching them from the lean-to with his usual expression of mild grievance. She waited for the thing people usually said. Cozy was the kind word. Some of them managed practical. A few didn't say anything at all, which was its own kind of statement. "You built the fence yourself, too," he said. She glanced at the fence line. Rough cedar posts, wire strung tight, corners braced properly. "Yes." "Posts are plumb." "I had a level." He dismounted and tied the horse to the fence post. "Most people don't bother to check." "Most people end up with leaning fences." He almost smiled at that. She let him inside. She showed him the oven because he'd asked, walking him through the construction process. The clay layers, the firing sequence, the way the dome shape distributed the heat, and he listened with the same focused attention she'd noticed in the street. He asked good questions. He asked about the moisture content of the clay and how she controlled the burn temperature and whether the insulation in the walls had been intentional or accidental. And these weren't the questions of a man making conversation. They were the questions of someone who built things himself and understood that building things required problem solving. "You could do this bigger," he said, studying the dome. "Scale it up. A structure like this done right, you could bake 4 times the volume." "I know." She crossed her arms. "I've thought about it. What's stopping you? Materials? Time? Money?" She paused. "No particular reason to make more than I can sell." He looked at her. "What if you had a reason?" The room was warm from the oven, and the bread smell was thick in the air, that particular alive smell of dough, working, yeast and wheat, and something deeper underneath. Claire was aware of being in a small space with a man she'd met 3 weeks ago, a man who kept coming back for reasons she hadn't fully worked out yet. And she was aware of her own caution rising up like it always did when something seemed like it might be more than it appeared. "I sell what I make," she said carefully. "If there's more demand than I can meet, I'll figure something out." He nodded, like he'd heard the real thing underneath the answer. He didn't push. They stood in her kitchen while the bread baked, and he told her about the East Pasture operation. 3 camps over the winter, 12 hands each, trying to feed them decent food on a frontier budget. She asked questions back. She knew something about provisioning because she'd been doing it for herself for years, and she had opinions about flour grades and storage and what kept through cold weather and what didn't. He listened to her with the same quality of attention he'd given the oven, and she had the unsettling feeling that this man had not once in the last hour treated her like someone whose opinion he was tolerating out of courtesy. When the bread came out, she gave him 2 loaves and wouldn't take payment. Tasting samples, she said, which was only half true. He took them without arguing. At the door he paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her in a way that she didn't entirely know what to do with. "This is a good place," he said. It wasn't a compliment dressed as something else. It was just a man saying what he thought. She said thank you, and meant it, and then he was gone. Buzz. She went back to the oven after he left and stood there with her hands still until the heat got uncomfortable. She was not foolish. She was not 17. She had been through enough. The barn dance, the years of being sturdy, the slow accumulation of small moments where she'd watched herself be dismissed. To know that warmth was not the same as interest, and interest was not the same as anything that would last. Men were curious about things until they weren't. Men were kind until kindness cost them something. But she caught herself thinking about the way he'd asked, "What's stopping you?" Not what's wrong with your setup, not a suggestion she'd be doing it better if only, just a direct question with the assumption underneath it that if something was stopping her, it was a practical problem with a practical solution. Not her, not some deficiency in her that she ought to acknowledge and accept. She pulled the third batch of bread from the oven and set it to cool and told herself to stop thinking about it. Outside, the prairie stretched out long and pale to the horizon, and the sky was doing the thing it did in September, vast and clear and a little ruthless, the way big things often are. Pocket-nosed at his feed, the cottonwood by the road track was just starting to turn. Clara Ashcombe stood in the door of her house and looked at all of it and felt, for the first time in a long time, like something might be about to change. She was not sure whether that was a good thing yet. She wasn't sure she trusted it, but she stood there a little longer than she needed to before she went back inside. He came back the following Wednesday. Clara had told herself she wasn't watching for him. She told herself that while she loaded the wagon, while she drove the 4 miles into Harwick, while she set up in front of Tillman's feed and grain with the canvas pulled back and the loaves arranged in 2 neat rows. She told herself that right up until she saw the bay horse coming up the main street and felt her stomach do something she hadn't given it permission to do. Elias dismounted, tied his horse, and walked over without hurrying. He bought 2 loaves, same as the first time, but he didn't leave. "Sold out yet?" he asked, looking at the wagon bed. "Still have 8. It's early." "It's always early when I get here. They move fast by 9. He leaned against the side of the wagon, arms crossed, and she waited for the part where this became about something. A business proposition, a question about bulk pricing, something that explained the return visits in a way that made clean sense. Instead, he said, "Did the 3rd batch come out the way you wanted? The one that was in the oven when I left?" She blinked. "You remembered that. You said the hydration was off, that you'd added too much water and weren't sure how the crust would set." She had said that, offhand while she was checking the oven, barely a comment. She hadn't thought he was listening that closely. "It was fine," she said. "Crust was a little softer than I wanted, but the crumb was good." He nodded like this was useful information. It probably was, if this was really about provisioning his camps. She reminded herself of that. "I talked to my foreman about the winter supply," he said. "Dell thinks we could use 20 loaves a week minimum across the 3 camps, more during the heavy work weeks." 20 loaves a week was more than she currently produced in a week total. She did the arithmetic quickly. "I'd need to expand the oven or the batching schedule. Probably both." What would that take? More clay from the creek, another week of construction, maybe 10 days, some help with the heavy work. She paused. "It's doable. I can send 2 men out to help with the construction if you tell me when." She looked at him. "You'd send ranch hands to build an oven." "I'd send ranch hands to secure a reliable bread supply," he said, and his face was perfectly even, but there was something just under the surface of it that she couldn't quite name. "That's good business." She should have agreed and left it there. Instead, she said, "Is it?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She told it to him the second Wednesday, in the middle of a conversation about flour storage, and she'd assumed it had gone the way most things went. In one ear, useful for about 30 seconds, gone. "I come back because the bread is the best I've had in this state," he said. "I come back because I have a genuine need for a reliable supply this winter. Both of those things are true." He stopped there, like he was deciding something. "They're not the only reasons." The street moved around them. A woman with a basket, 2 boys chasing something, the eternal creak of a freight wagon, and Clara stood very still. "I'm not looking for anything from you," he added, and he said it carefully, like he understood that carefulness was required. "I'm not trying to complicate your situation. I find myself interested in talking to you, that's all I'm saying." She didn't know what to do with that. Honesty from men, in her experience, usually came wrapped in something else. But he wasn't leaning in, wasn't performing anything, wasn't giving her the look that meant he expected something back. He just stood there and waited, like whatever she said next was fine. "You could talk to plenty of people," she said. "I could." A beat. "Most of them aren't as interesting." She sold the last 8 loaves in the next 40 minutes, and he stayed through all of it, not talking much, just there. When she climbed up to the wagon seat to head home, he untied the horse without being asked and held the bridle steady until she had the reins sorted. "Next Wednesday," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It was something in between, and she hated that she liked the sound of it. "Next Wednesday," she said, and clicked Pocket into a walk. Sit. October arrived like it always did in Nebraska, fast, and without much warning. One morning, the kitchen garden was still producing, and then overnight the temperature dropped 20 degrees and everything went brown at once. Clara spent a full day harvesting what she could salvage, her breath making white clouds in the cold air, her hands going stiff in a way that made her think about winter, the way she always had to think about it. Not as a season, but as a problem to be managed. The firewood situation was not good. She had enough stacked to get through November, maybe early December if she was careful, but the back corner of the lean-to had a soft spot in the roof that was going to let water in once the snow started, and she hadn't had time to deal with it. She'd been spending her extra hours baking for the increased order. Elias had sent 2 men out the previous week, as promised, and they'd helped her extend the oven in a long day of work that left her exhausted and pleased. The new capacity was roughly double the old one. She'd run 3 test batches and the results were good. She hadn't seen Elias himself since Wednesday. She was not counting the days. She was absolutely counting the days. What bothered her wasn't that she was thinking about him. She was 24 and alive and capable of noticing a man. That was just honest. What bothered her was the particular quality of the thinking, the way it kept circling back not to his face or the breadth of his shoulders, but to the way he'd listened, the questions he'd asked, the way he'd said, "I find myself interested in talking to you," like it was a simple fact that he was just reporting, not a thing he was deploying to get something. She'd known men who said things like that. They usually wanted something specific and were patient about getting to it. But 3 weeks had passed since that conversation, and he'd bought bread and asked about the oven expansion and talked about winter provisioning and had not once pushed past whatever line she'd drawn without quite knowing she was drawing it. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't leaned in. He'd fixed the loose board on the wagon bed one Wednesday morning without asking permission or making anything of it. Just noticed it was loose and tightened it while she was counting change for another customer, and hadn't mentioned it at all. She thought about that more than the other things. The not mentioning it part. Martha Tillman mentioned it, of course. Martha Tillman mentioned everything. "Elias Rowan's been coming by your wagon every Wednesday and Saturday for a month now," she said, appearing at Clara's elbow on a Saturday morning while Clara was still setting up. "People are noticing." "People can notice whatever they like," Clara said. "Ruth Denton says he turned down an invitation to her daughter's social last month. The daughter's very pretty." Martha paused to let this land. "Very slim." Clara set down a loaf with slightly more force than necessary. "Good for Ruth Denton's daughter. I'm not saying anything bad." Martha held up both hands. "I'm just saying people are curious. People are always curious about things that are none of their business." Martha looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite respect, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "You could let yourself be a little bit glad about it, Clara. It wouldn't kill you." "I'm working," Clara said. Martha left, but the conversation stuck like a burr. The thing was, Clara understood what Martha was saying, and she understood the kindness that was messily underneath it. What she couldn't explain, not to Martha, not to herself in any clean way, was that being glad about it required believing it was real. And believing it was real required a kind of trust that she had not been able to hold on to. Every time she reached for it, she hit the same wall. Men like that, men who had options, did not end up caring about women like her. Not in the way that lasted, not in the way that was the actual thing. She knew what she looked like. She'd known her whole life, and she'd made her peace with it, or she thought she had, until Elias Rowan showed up and started making her uncertain about all of it. He came on Wednesday with a split lip and a bruised knuckle on his right hand. She noticed it when he reached for the coins, the swelling along the second knuckle, the cut that had scabbed over at the corner of his mouth. He noticed her noticing. "Fence dispute," he said. "On which end of it?" "Mine." He said it without apology. "Neighbor's been cutting my east line for 2 seasons. I went over to discuss it." "With your fist?" "He threw first." Clara looked at him. He looked back, not entirely comfortable, not quite sheepish. It was the most human she'd seen him. A little roughed up, a little embarrassed, the controlled composure from their previous conversation sitting slightly crooked on him. "Did it resolve the dispute?" she said. "Mostly." A beat. "I'll probably hear from his brother." That sounds like a no. He almost smiled, and this time it actually made it to his face. "I've had worse problems." She reached under the wagon seat where she kept a small tin of supplies. She'd started keeping it there in the fall, almost without acknowledging why, and handed him a clean cloth and a small jar of pine tar salve. He looked at them. "For the knuckle," she said. "If it's not cleaned out, it'll stiffen up on you." He took them without making a thing of it. He sat on the wagon step and cleaned the knuckle himself, working carefully, and she went back to selling bread and didn't watch him. Except she did, in her peripheral vision, the particular focused quiet of a man attending to himself, the way he pressed the cloth to the cut without flinching. "You keep a kit in the wagon," he said. "I'm 4 miles from town and I work with fire and sharp things. It seemed practical." "Who taught you?" "My father, mostly. He wasn't good at much, but he was good at not panicking when something went wrong." She handed change to a woman in a blue bonnet and turned back. He said panic was for people who hadn't bothered to prepare. Elias was watching her. What was he like? Nobody had asked her that in 2 years. Most people in Harwick hadn't known her father, and the ones who had tended to describe him with the diplomatic vagueness people used for men who were complicated. He had been complicated. He'd been stubborn and often wrong and bad with money and occasionally kind in a way that caught you off guard, and she'd loved him in the difficult way you loved people who weren't easy to love. He was hard, she said. Not mean, just hard. Everything was work, and work was the point of everything. She sorted another loaf without looking up. He thought I was competent. That was his highest opinion of anyone. I think he meant it as a compliment. It is a compliment. I know that now. She glanced at him. At 15, I would have liked something warmer. He was quiet for a moment. My father thought I was soft, he said. Spent about 10 years trying to convince me he was right. She looked at him then. He wasn't, Elias added, flat. But it took a while to be sure of that. She understood in that moment that this man carried something too. Not the same thing she carried. His was different in shape, different in origin, but the weight of it was recognizable. The way it sat in him, present but not collapsed under, held but not resolved. She handed him back the tin lid to close the salve jar. Their fingers didn't quite touch. "You should have that looked at properly," she said. "The lip." "I've had worse." "You keep saying that like it's reassuring." This time he actually laughed, brief and a little surprised, like he hadn't expected to. It changed his face entirely. She cataloged that without meaning to. The first hard frost came that night. Clara woke to a cold that had teeth in it, the oven long since gone to embers, her breath visible in the dark. She lay still for a minute, listening to the wind work at the corners of the sod walls, that particular low whine that meant the gaps needed checking. Then she got up because there was no point lying there being cold when she could be doing something about it. By the time the sky started going gray, she'd restoked the oven, patched 2 gaps in the north wall with fresh clay, and discovered that the soft spot in the lean-to roof had not held through the first freeze. One of her firewood stacks had gotten wet on the top layer. She pulled the wet wood out, stacked the dry wood separately, and stood in the cold lean-to looking at the gap in the roof with her hands on her hips. She could fix it. She'd fixed things before. But fixing a roof alone in winter was the kind of job that required someone to hold things while another person nailed them, and she didn't have a someone for that. She patched it the best she could with oilcloth and went inside and baked bread instead, because the bread was a problem she knew how to solve. Elias showed up that Saturday to find her still unhappy about the roof, which she hadn't mentioned to him and didn't intend to. He noticed anyway. She caught him looking at the lean-to while he tied his horse, looking at it the way he looked at things he was assessing. The northwest corner, he said when she came out to meet him. It's fine. It's not fine. That's going to let ice in when the temperature drops again. I know that. I've dealt with it temporarily. With oilcloth. She crossed her arms. I'm aware of my own roof. He looked at her for a moment, that steady look. I'm not saying you aren't. You're standing in my yard critiquing my roof. I'm standing in your yard noticing that your roof has a problem. A pause. There's a difference. She wanted to argue with that distinction and couldn't, which was irritating in its own right. She went inside and got his bread order, and they went through the transaction, and he stayed after. The way he always stayed after now. The way she'd stopped pretending to herself that she didn't expect him to. And she made coffee because the cold justified it, and they sat at the table near the oven. He didn't bring up the roof again. They talked about the camps, about the change in weather, about a dispute at the county land office that he'd gotten pulled into on behalf of a neighbor. She asked questions because the land office issue was actually complicated and she knew the area he was describing, and they went back and forth on it for a while, and she forgot to be careful. That was the thing about talking to Elias. She kept forgetting to be careful. There's something I've been wondering, he said when the coffee was almost gone. She waited. The first time I came to your wagon, I asked where you were located. You hesitated before you answered. He looked at his cup. Not afraid exactly. More like you were deciding something. She was quiet. You don't have to tell me, he said. I was deciding whether to tell you at all, she said. Most people who ask where I live are asking because they're curious. The way people are curious about... She stopped, chose her words. About how a woman ends up alone out here. He looked at her. The story people tell themselves about me, she said, is that I'm out here because I couldn't make it work somewhere else. That I'm alone because the alternative didn't present itself. She said it evenly, like it didn't cost anything. I've heard people say it, not always behind my back. Elias set his cup down. I told you where I lived because you asked like it was a practical question, she said. Not like you were trying to complete a picture you'd already decided on. He was quiet for long enough that she started to feel exposed in the way she always felt when she said too much. The story people tell themselves is wrong, he said. I know that. I know you know. He met her eyes. I'm saying it anyway. The oven popped behind her. Pocket moved in the lean-to, making the particular sound he made when he was settling down for the morning. The wind was still at the corners of the house, but the inside was warm, and the coffee smell was still in the air, and Clara Ashcombe sat across from a man who kept coming back and kept saying things she didn't quite know how to carry, and she felt the wall she'd built, careful, patient, necessary, shift just slightly under its own weight. She didn't say anything. He didn't push. But he stayed another hour, and when he left, he spent 20 minutes on the lean-to roof, without asking, just pulled what he needed from the small toolbox in his saddlebag and fixed the corner properly while she stood in the doorway watching him work. And when he was done, he just came in and washed his hands at the basin and said he'd see her Wednesday. She stood in the yard a long time after he rode away. The sky was low and iron-colored, the kind of sky that meant snow was coming, and the prairie was going still the way it did before weather. She was cold standing there. She knew she was cold. She stayed out there anyway. The snow came on a Tuesday and didn't stop for 3 days. Clara had been through Nebraska winters before, but this one had a particular meanness to it. Not just the cold, which was deep and constant, but the wind that came with it, the kind that found every gap and pushed through like it was looking for something. She kept the oven burning around the clock, sleeping in 2-hour stretches and waking to stoke it, monitoring the walls for new cracks that the freeze-thaw cycle kept opening. The lean-to held because Elias had fixed the corner properly, and that small fact sat with her in a way she didn't examine too closely. She couldn't get to Harwick on Wednesday. The drifts across the Callaway Road were knee-high in places and Pocket wasn't up to it, and the truth was neither was she. She stayed home and baked anyway because the routine steadied her, and she ate bread and dried beans and waited for the weather to break. It broke on Friday morning. By Saturday she had the road passable, the wagon loaded, and herself in motion before the sun was fully up. Elias was already there when she arrived. Not at the usual spot in front of Tillman's. He was at the end of the street, watching the road in from the east, and when he saw her wagon, he rode over at a pace that was not quite casual. I came out Wednesday, he said, pulling alongside, to the house. You weren't there. She blinked. I was there. I couldn't get the wagon out. I know that now. I didn't know it then. He looked at her the way she'd seen him look at the lean-to roof, assessing, a little tight around the jaw. I knocked for about 10 minutes before I figured you'd sheltered somewhere. I was probably at the oven. I wouldn't have heard you over the wind. He was quiet for a moment. You were all right. It wasn't a question, exactly. It was the version of a question a man asked when he already knew the answer but needed to hear it anyway. I was all right, she said. I've done worse winters alone. Something moved in his face at the word alone. Brief, almost invisible. She filed it away and pulled the wagon into the usual spot, and they went about the business of the morning, and neither of them said anything more about it. But she thought about it. Him riding out 4 miles in the snow because she'd missed a Wednesday. Not sending Dell. Coming himself. Knocking for 10 minutes. Working out what had probably happened and riding home in weather that was genuinely unpleasant. Not mentioning it on Saturday until she'd said she was there. She thought about it more than she was comfortable with. December settled in hard and permanent, the way December did on the plains. Clara expanded her baking schedule to match the camp order, which meant she was working from before dawn until mid-morning 6 days a week, and then using the afternoons for everything else. The firewood, the repairs, the slow grinding work of keeping a homestead functional in cold weather. She was tired in a way that was different from summer tired, heavier and less clean. Some mornings she stood at the oven in the dark and felt the weariness in her bones like a second skeleton. She didn't complain about it. There was no one to complain to, and complaining didn't do much for the firewood situation anyway. Elias came by the homestead on a Thursday, not a market day, which was new. He had a pack horse with him loaded with 2 things, a quarter side of beef from the ranch stores, wrapped in burlap, and a bundle of seasoned firewood cut to her stove length. She came out of the house and looked at the pack horse and looked at him. I told you I'd compensate for the expanded order, he said, before she could say anything. The beef is part of that, so is the wood. I didn't ask for wood. No, but you're burning twice the fuel now with the expanded baking, and I saw your stack was low last time I was here. She crossed her arms. Not because she was angry. She wasn't, not exactly. But because the gesture gave her something to do while she worked out what she felt. What she felt was complicated. Part of it was the same practical relief that any person felt when a resource problem got addressed. Part of it was something warmer and more unsettling than that, the kind of feeling she'd spent months trying to keep at a manageable distance. You can't keep doing things for me, she said. Why not? Because She stopped. It changes the shape of things. He dismounted and started untying the burlap bundle from the pack horse with the matter-of-fact efficiency she'd come to recognize as just how he moved through the world. No wasted motion, no performance. Does it have to change anything you don't want changed? That's not the point. What is the point? She struggled with that for a moment. The point was that she didn't want to owe him. The point was that owing people led to a particular kind of vulnerability she'd learned, slowly and at some cost, to protect herself against. The point was that when people did things for you and then eventually stopped, the absence of the thing they'd been doing felt like a hole in the floor, and she'd fallen through enough holes. She didn't say any of that. I pay my way, she said instead. I know you do. He glanced up from the rope. This is payment for the bread contract. I told you, beef and firewood are how the ranch compensates supply partners in winter. That's the arrangement. Is it actually? He met her eyes. A beat. Partially. She almost wanted to laugh and didn't. You're not good at pretending. I'm not trying to pretend. He finished with the rope and straightened. I'm trying to give you something you need without making it into something that feels like charity, because I know you'd send the charity back. But I'm not going to keep pretending that I don't notice things. He looked at her steadily. You're running yourself thin, Clara. The expanded order was my idea and the fuel cost is on me. That's just fair. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was sharp, and her hands were already stiffening, and there was a bread batch in the oven that needed checking in about 20 minutes. All right, she said. All right. But I'm keeping the account. I'll deduct it from the bread rate. He started to say something, and she held up a hand. I need it to be a transaction, she said. Quieter now, less defensive. I need it to make sense in a way I can keep track of. That's just how I'm built. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something careful and almost gentle. All right, he said again, keep the account. They put the beef in the cold cellar and stacked the firewood in the lean-to, working side by side without much talking, their breath making the same white clouds in the cold air, and Clara had the strange and somewhat alarming sensation that this felt normal. This specifically, him here, both of them working, the homestead less quiet than it usually was. It felt like something she'd been missing without knowing what she was missing. That was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in months. Teak. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Clara baked an extra batch and left half of it on the doorstep of old Agnes Pruitt, who lived alone at the edge of Harwick, and whose hands had gotten too stiff for cooking, and she went home and ate her own supper and slept fine. She'd stopped expecting Christmas to be anything other than a cold Thursday, and that expectation had served her reasonably well. What she hadn't expected was Elias coming by on the 26th with a book. He handed it to her without preamble or particular ceremony, just held it out when she opened the door, and she took it before she thought about what she was doing. It was a thick volume, cloth-bound in dark green, the spine reading Practical Engineering for Farm and Homestead Structures. She stood in the doorway and turned it over in her hands. There's a chapter on fired clay oven construction, he said, including commercial-scale designs. I thought it might be relevant. She opened it. The pages were dense and detailed. Diagrams, measurements, material specifications. It was exactly the kind of book she would have gone looking for if she'd known it existed. Where did you find this? She said. Ordered it from a printer in St. Louis. Took about 6 weeks. He paused. I ordered it in October. She looked up. He was watching her with that steady, patient look that she'd spent months trying to decode. In October, she'd told him about the oven expansion, and he'd apparently gone home and ordered her a book about it. In October, before the fence dispute, before the snow, before the firewood. When they were still, technically, just a baker and a customer with a bread contract. Elias, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. I'm not trying to push anything, he said. The words were careful, but his face was not. His face showed something that was too honest to be comfortable for either of them. I know you've got walls up. I know why. I'm not asking you to take them down all at once. A beat. I'm not sure I'm asking you to take them down at all. I wanted you to have the book. She looked down at it. The green cloth cover, the particular weight of it. It's a good book, she said finally. I thought it would be. She stepped back from the doorway. Coffee's on. He came in. January was relentless. February was worse. Clara got sick in the 3rd week of January, Seth. Not badly, not the kind of sick that put her down. Just a chest cold that sat on her like a wet coat and made every breath a little more work than it should have been. She kept baking because the contract required it, kept driving to Harwick on her schedule, kept doing all the things that needed doing while her body staged a low-level protest about all of it. She told no one because there was no one to tell. Elias noticed on Wednesday. She saw the moment he saw it, the slight compression of his expression, the way his attention sharpened. You sound rough, he said. I'm fine. You don't sound fine. I sound like someone with a chest cold in January. It's nothing unusual. He bought his bread, and she waited for him to leave because she didn't have the energy today for the longer conversation. And instead he said, Is the oven keeping the house warm enough? Yes. You're not rationing the fuel to save it. She opened her mouth to say, Of course not, and he looked at her and she closed it again. Clara. The batch schedule requires a certain amount of fuel, she said a little stiffly. I've been prioritizing the baking fire. He stared at her. You're rationing heat for the house to keep up with my order. I'm managing resources. It's not acceptable. He said it with a flatness that wasn't anger but was something close to it. If the baking contract is costing you your health, we renegotiate the contract. I'm not renegotiating over a chest cold. It's not about the chest cold and you know it. He crossed his arms. When did you last sleep a full night? She didn't answer. I'm sending Dell out tomorrow with more fuel. I told you. I'll put it on the account. He said it exactly the way she'd said it to him, with the same inflection. And she recognized her own words coming back at her and felt the complicated thing that was both frustration and something like gratitude, tangled together in a way she couldn't separate. She looked at him across the wagon bed. Her chest hurt. She was tired in the heavy bone-deep way that came from weeks of not quite sleeping, and the cold was sitting on her shoulders, and she was so tired of managing everything alone, so quietly and absolutely tired of it, and he was standing there being immovable in the most frustrating possible way. "I hate this," she said. "I know. I don't like needing things." "I know that too." His voice had changed, still steady, but softer now. "Clara, let me send the fuel." She looked down at the wagon bed, at the bread, which was good bread, which she was proud of, which she'd made while not sleeping well in a house she'd been keeping cold to preserve the supply that his order required. She thought about the book on engineering. She thought about 10 minutes of knocking in a snowstorm. She thought about the firewood stacked in her lean-to, which she'd been very careful not to think about too much. "All right," she said, "send the fuel." He nodded. Something in him settled slightly, the way things settled when a tension released that had been held for a long time. She drove home that Wednesday, and by Saturday the chest cold had started to lift, and the house was warm the way it was supposed to be. And she sat at the table in the evening with the engineering book open to the commercial oven chapter and thought about what she wanted to build and what it would take. It was a Thursday in late February, a week that had gone quiet after a hard windstorm, the kind of stillness that came on the plains after something rough had moved through. Elias arrived in the mid-morning. He'd helped her move some materials. She was already planning the next oven expansion, using the book's specifications, working out what she'd need before spring, and they'd been at it for about an hour when she said something that surprised her. "Why aren't you married?" She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It had been in her head for weeks in the way that questions settled into you when you kept pushing them aside, and it had come out because her guard was down from working, from the easy back-and-forth rhythm they'd fallen into without her noticing when it happened. He set down the beam he'd been holding and looked at her. "I was." He said it without flinching, but carefully. "My wife died 6 years ago. Fever, second winter on the ranch." She went still. "I'm sorry." Her name was Frances. He picked the beam back up, settled it into position, held it there. She was a good woman, practical, same as you. We were matched more than chosen, if I'm honest. Families thought it made sense." A pause. "It wasn't unhappy. It just wasn't what I understood a marriage could be until it was too late to—" He stopped. "After she died, I spent a long time not thinking about it." Clara handed him the nail she'd been holding. And then I found a woman selling bread out of a wagon, and I couldn't stop thinking about her, which was inconvenient." He said it to the beam, not to her, because she was clearly someone who was not going to make anything easy. She almost dropped the mallet. "I make things easy." "You make bread easy. You make everything else into a negotiation." He glanced at her sideways, and his expression had something in it that was warm and dry and a little tired, and she recognized that too, because she'd made him work for every small thing, and they both knew it. "I have reasons," she said. "I know you have reasons." He held the beam steady while she drove the nail. "I'm not arguing with the reasons. I'm just saying, you asked why I'm not married, and the answer is that the only person I've wanted to sit across from every day for the past 5 months lives 4 miles from town and is currently holding a mallet she's thinking about using on my head." She lowered the mallet. The beam sat solid in its place. Around them, the half-frame structure of the oven extension stood in the thin winter light, raw and unfinished and already showing the shape of what it was going to become. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because there was too much of it, and she'd spent so long being careful that even now, standing at the edge of something she'd stopped believing was possible for her, the old fear rose up with its old arguments. He doesn't mean it the way you want him to mean it. This is what warmth feels like before it ends. You are not the kind of woman men choose when they're choosing for keeps. But she thought about 10 minutes of knocking in a snowstorm, about a book ordered in October, about your running yourself thin, Clara said with the specific quiet of a man who had been watching and paying attention and not requiring anything back. "I have conditions," she said. He waited. "I keep the account." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Everything goes through the account. I pay my part of everything. I handle my own affairs. I don't become someone's—" She searched for the word. "Someone's project. Someone they're managing." "Clara." He said her name like it meant something specific. I don't want to manage you. I barely manage myself. She almost smiled. You do all right. You have remarkably low standards for all right. This time she did smile, just slightly, and it felt strange on her face. Not because she never smiled, but because this one was unguarded in a way she hadn't let herself be in a very long time. I'm afraid, she said. She said it flat and plain because she was done performing composure she didn't have. I know. He said it just as plain. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you to let me be here while you are. The wind moved over the roof of the unfinished structure. Pocket made a sound from the lean-to. The prairie stretched out wide and cold and indifferent in every direction, which was its nature, and always had been, and she had never expected it to care. But this man was standing in her yard in February, holding a beam in place until she was ready to nail it, and he had been doing some version of that since October, and she was 24 years old and tired, genuinely, profoundly tired, of carrying everything by herself. All right, she said, for the third time in as many months. It was becoming, she supposed, her answer to him. The thing she said when she ran out of reasons to say anything else. He nodded, same as he always did, and they went back to work. The word got out the way words always got out in Holt County. Not all at once, but in pieces, each piece slightly wrong, assembled by the time it reached most people into something that bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. What Martha Tillman told the Women's Sewing Circle was that Elias Rowan had been spending considerable time at the Ashcombe homestead and had made his intentions known. What the Sewing Circle told their husbands was that Rowan was courting the baker woman out on Callaway Road. What the husbands told each other at the feed store was that Rowan had apparently taken up with that large woman who sold bread from the wagon, which prompted a silence that said more than any words that followed it. Clara heard most of this secondhand through Martha, who delivered information the way the Postal Service delivered mail, regular, regardless of whether you'd asked for it. People are talking, Martha said, on a Wednesday morning in early March, appearing at the wagon with her basket over one arm and her expression carefully arranged into something between concern and satisfaction. People were talking in October, Clara said. I assumed they'd moved on. They moved on from the wondering part. Now they're at the... Martha searched for a word. The opinions part. Which opinions? Martha set her basket on the wagon board and looked at Clara directly, which meant whatever was coming was going to be honest enough to require eye contact. Ruth Denton says she doesn't understand what he sees in you. She said it to Vera Holt at the milliner's on Saturday, loud enough that Vera mentioned it to me. Clara kept her hands busy with the bread. Ruth Denton's daughter is still unmarried, she said. I imagine that's relevant context. Her daughter is very pretty. So I've been told. She made change for a man in a canvas coat without looking up. Ruth Denton's opinion of me is not new information, Martha. No. Martha was quiet for a moment. But she's not the only one saying it. Jim Pierce told my husband that Rowan must have gone soft, his words, to be spending time out at a sod house on Callaway Road. A pause. He didn't say soft. Clara stopped moving. She stood with a loaf of bread in each hand and the cold morning air around her and let that sit for a second. It wasn't the first time she'd heard words like that aimed at her, not by 20 years. She knew the arithmetic of what people saw when they looked at her. Not the oven she'd built, not the contract she'd fulfilled through a hard winter, not the work she'd done to stay on land that was hers and paid for. Just the body she inhabited and the small life they'd decided was all she deserved. What was new was that the words weren't quite aimed at her this time. They were aimed at him. And the thought of Elias walking through Harwick while men said things like that about his choices because of her, that landed somewhere she hadn't expected. What did your husband say back? She asked. He told Jim Pierce to mind his own affairs. Martha almost smiled. Tom has his moments. Clara set the loaves down and took a breath. It'll settle, she said. It might, Martha said. Or Rowan will have to settle it himself. She picked up 2 loaves and counted out her coins. Men like Pierce only stop talking when the person they're talking about stops looking uncertain. Clara thought about that for a long time after Martha left. Elias came by the homestead that Thursday. He'd been coming out twice a week now, sometimes 3 times, and the pattern of it had become the rhythm of her weeks in a way that she'd stopped fighting. They worked on the oven extension together, going through the engineering book section by section, arguing about specifications in the focused back and forth that she'd come to understand was just how they were together. Not hostile, not competitive, just two people who had opinions and said them. She told him what Martha had told her. Not to make it his problem, but because she'd decided some weeks ago that she was tired of managing things alone. And that meant the difficult things too, not just the firewood. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a bolt over in his hands. "Jim Pierce," he said. "You know him." "I know him. We've been on opposite sides of the county water rights discussion for 2 years." He set the bolt down. "He's not a man whose opinion I've spent much time worrying about. It's not just him." "I know it's not just him." He looked at her. "Does it change anything for you?" She thought about that honestly, which took a moment. "It makes me angry," she said. "Not at you, just angry in the general direction of people who've decided they know what you should want." "Same." His voice was even, but his jaw wasn't. "I'm going to be in Harwick on Saturday. I'll come by the wagon." "You come by the wagon every Saturday?" "I'll come by the wagon, and I'll stay longer than usual." He said it plainly. "I'm not going to stand somewhere else, so Jim Pierce doesn't have to watch me be where I want to be." She looked at him. "I'm not performing anything," he said, and she believed him because she'd learned his face well enough by now to know when he was being direct. I'm not going to hide somewhere, that's all." It was a small thing, probably. The kind of small thing that was only small from a distance. From where Clara was standing, it felt larger, with a weight and a shape to it that she catalogued carefully and kept. "All right," she said. "Saturday." What? Saturday in Harwick was busy for early March. The weather had broken enough to bring people out, and there was talk of a land auction at the courthouse that had drawn people from across the county. Clara's wagon was surrounded from nearly the moment she arrived, which meant she had no time to think about much beyond bread and change and the ongoing negotiation of moving people through quickly. She sold out in 40 minutes, which had never happened before. Elias arrived while she was selling the last 4 loaves, and he stood beside the wagon while she finished. He was talking to Del Marsh, who had his own horse and his own reasons to be in town, and he was doing what he always did. Not performing anything, not making a show, just being where he was, which happened to be beside her wagon, in front of Tillman's Feed and Grain, in plain sight of Harwick's entire Saturday population. She noticed who noticed. Ruth Denton noticed from across the street, with a face arranged into an expression that was working very hard to appear unconcerned. 2 men outside the courthouse noticed, and one of them said something to the other. Martha Tillman noticed, and made absolutely no effort to pretend she hadn't. What Clara also noticed was a woman she hadn't seen before, younger, maybe 19, standing near the milliner's with a baby on her hip and watching the wagon with an expression that wasn't judgment. It was something more like recognition. The woman caught Clara's eye and gave her a small nod, the kind that meant something specific between women, and then looked away. Clara sold the last loaf and folded the canvas. "Sold out again," Dell said, sounding pleased in a proprietary way that she found more charming than she wanted to. "Earlier than last week." She climbed up to the wagon seat. "I need to recalculate the Saturday quantity." "I was thinking," Elias said, moving to stand beside the wagon wheel. He'd done that thing he did sometimes, where he waited until she was at a natural pause to say something he'd clearly been working up to. She'd learned to recognize the slight change in his posture. "There's a piece of ground on the east side of the ranch, between the main house and the bunkhouse, sheltered from the north wind by the tree line." She looked down at him. "It's a good site for a structure," he said. "Good drainage, close enough to the kitchen well, room to expand. I had a man look at it last month. He said you could put up a proper bakehouse, stone foundation, timber frame, 2 or 3 ovens, for reasonable cost given the materials we've got on hand from the east fence rebuild." She was very still. "I'm not telling you to move," he said carefully. "I'm telling you about a piece of ground." He met her eyes. "If you wanted to build something on it, something that was yours, that's on your land. I know whose land it is." He paused. "I know what I'm saying, Clara." She looked at him for a long moment. The street moved around them, all its Saturday noise, the auction crowd, the freighters. Ruth Denton still doing an impressive job of not looking. The wind came down from the north with a cold edge that would be gone in 6 weeks. and the sky over the prairie was the pale, colorless blue of early spring, and everything felt very large and very specific at the same time. I need to think about it, she said. I know. That's not a no. I know that too. He stepped back from the wheel. Take whatever time you need. She drove home and thought about it for 3 days straight, which meant she thought about it while she baked, and while she fixed the south fence post that had heaved out of the ground in the freeze, and while she sat at the table with the engineering book open to the commercial section. She thought about what it meant to build something on someone else's land, even if that someone was Elias. She thought about what it meant to not build it, to stay in the sod house indefinitely, growing the operation until it outgrew the space and then stopping, because stopping was what happened when you ran out of room. She thought about the woman with the baby at the milliner's and the nod. She thought about her father saying competent like it was the highest word he knew. On the third day, she rode out to the east side of the Double R and looked at the piece of ground herself, without telling Elias. She tied Pocket to the fence line and walked the site, checking the drainage and the wind exposure and the distance to the well, and she stood on the sheltered south side, where the tree line broke the north wind and felt the specific quality of the air there, which was noticeably calmer than the exposed ground 20 feet away. It was a good sight. She hated how much she couldn't argue with that. The person who forced the issue, in the end, was not Elias or Clara or even Martha Tillman. It was James Pierce. She was loading the wagon on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks after Elias had shown her the site, when she heard the voice behind her. She'd heard it before at a distance and would have recognized it anyway from the specific quality of confidence it carried, the confidence of a man who'd never had much reason to lower his voice. Miss Ashcombe. She turned around. Pierce was a big man going soft through the middle, with a face that had been weathered into something not quite mean but not far from it. He had another man with her she didn't recognize, younger, wearing a town coat that was too good for a Wednesday morning in Harwick. Mr. Pierce, she said, heard you've been spending time at the Double R. He said it with the particular casualness that meant he'd been planning to say it and wanted her to think he hadn't. Rowan's place. I supply bread to Rowan's ranch camps, she said. I imagine that's not news to anyone. That's one way to put it. He looked at her in the way she recognized. The assessment, the conclusion drawn before any evidence was actually examined. A man like Rowan ought to be more careful about who he's associating with, professionally speaking. The younger man in the town coat looked faintly uncomfortable, like he hadn't signed up for this particular conversation. Clara set down the loaf she'd been holding. Professionally speaking, she said, he's got a reputation in this county. Takes work to build that kind of name. Pity to see it confused by poor choices. She looked at him steadily. She was angry. She could feel it clearly, like a heat source. But the anger was clean and functional, not the panicked kind. Are you saying this to me, she said, because you think I'll pass it along? Or because you think I'll do something about it myself? Pierce blinked. He'd expected something else, evidently. Some version of lowered eyes and flushed cheeks and a mumbled apology, which was probably what he got from most people he talked to this way. I'm saying it, he said, because someone should. No one asked you to. She picked up the loaf again and placed it in the wagon. I've been filling a bread contract for the Double R Ranch Camp since October. My operation is sound, my product is good, and Elias Rowan is capable of making his own professional decisions. But you know all that already. She turned back to the wagon. What you don't like is something else entirely, and I think we both understand what that is, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. The silence behind her had a texture to it. You've got a mouth on you, Pierce said, but the edge had shifted in his voice. Not into respect exactly, but into something that recognized it had met resistance it hadn't planned for. I've got bread to sell, she said. Are you buying any? He wasn't. He left, and the younger man followed, and Clara sold 10 loaves in the next hour and drove home feeling the particular clean exhaustion of having said an honest thing to a difficult person and not regretted it. She told Elias that Saturday. All of it, exactly as it had happened. He listened, the same compression around his jaw as when she'd told him about Pierce's earlier comments, but controlled, the way he controlled things when he'd decided control was more useful than reaction. He won't be buying bread then, Elias said. I don't imagine so. His loss. He looked at her. Are you all right? I was angry, she said. I'm less angry now. You handled it. I did. She said it simply, without performance. I've been handling things like that my whole life. The difference is... She stopped. What? The difference is that this time I wasn't thinking about whether I'd still have anywhere to land if it went wrong. She looked at him. That was different. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something settle in his face. Not surprise exactly, but something that looked like a man carefully taking in information he'd hoped for and hadn't quite trusted yet. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not dramatically, not in a way that was about anything other than what it was. Just covered her hand with his, brief and warm, and then let go. About the piece of ground, she said. Yes. I went and looked at it. He nodded, like he'd known she would and had been waiting. The drainage is good, she said. The wind shelter is better than I expected. The distance to the well works if we run a secondary line. She took a breath. I've got a layout in my head. 2 ovens to start, room for a third. Stone foundation, like you said. I want the east wall open for light. All right. I want my name on the deed for the structure. Done. She looked at him. Just like that. Clara. He said it with the specific patience of a man who had been waiting 5 months for her to get here and was not about to complicate the last step. I was always going to say done. I've been waiting for you to ask. She sat with that for a moment. The full weight of it. A name on a deed, a structure on good ground, a foundation that was hers even if the land beneath it was his. The specific architecture of trust that required. I have one more condition, she said. He waited. I'm not doing it because you suggested it, she said. I'm doing it because it's the right site and the timing makes sense, and my current operation has outgrown the sod house. I need you to know I know the difference. He held her gaze. I know you know the difference. I need you to not forget it. I won't. She nodded. Once. Outside, the March wind had shifted direction, coming from the southwest now, which meant warmer weather was on its way. The kind of shift you could feel before you could measure it. Subtle, underneath everything else, changing the temperature of the world by degrees. When can your men break ground, she said. And just like that, they were planning. Del Marsh heard about it first, because Del Marsh always heard about things first, and he told the 2 ranch hands who had helped with the original oven extension, and those men told others. And by the end of the week, the Double R crew largely knew that the baker from Callaway Road was putting up a bakehouse on the east site, which prompted a range of reactions from enthusiastic to confused to one memorable comment from an older hand named Grover, who said he didn't understand the situation, but the bread had been considerably better since October, and he wasn't asking questions. Harwick heard it from Martha Tillman, who had heard it from Clara directly because Clara had decided that if people were going to talk about her, they might as well have accurate information to work with. Martha received this confidence with barely contained satisfaction and redistributed it with a speed and thoroughness that Clara estimated would have the entire county informed within a week. Ruth Denton heard it and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The young woman with the baby, Clara had learned her name was Iris, that she'd come west with her husband 2 years ago and was having a hard winter for reasons that were various and private, came to the wagon the following Wednesday and bought 2 loaves and said quietly, while she was counting her coins, I heard about the bakehouse. That's a good thing. I think so, Clara said. My husband says Rowan is solid. Iris looked up briefly. I think he means it as a compliment. I think they all do, Clara said, and Iris almost smiled, and that was its own kind of small exchange that mattered. Work on the foundation began the 2nd week of April, when the ground had thawed enough to dig properly. Clara was there for all of it, not just supervising, but working, because she was not the kind of person who commissioned something and walked away from it, and because she'd drawn the specifications herself and no one else knew exactly what she meant by them. She and Elias worked side by side on the weekends, him and 2 ranch hands and Dell occasionally on the weekdays, the structure coming up steadily through April in the thin new spring light. She still drove to Harwick on Wednesdays and Saturdays. She still sold bread from the wagon in front of Tillman's. She was still Clara Ashcombe of the sod house on Callaway Road, same as she'd always been, except that wasn't entirely true anymore. And she knew it, and the knowing of it was something she was still learning to carry without flinching. She thought sometimes about what she'd told Elias, so the difference is that this time I wasn't thinking about whether I'd still have anywhere to land. She'd meant it as an explanation of something small, but the more she turned it over, the bigger it seemed. Her whole adult life she'd made decisions from the position of a person who expected to lose the ground underfoot. She'd built her own oven, fixed her own fence, refused help she'd needed because needing things made you vulnerable to their absence. She'd kept the account, kept the distance, kept herself arranged into a shape that didn't require anyone else to hold together. And somewhere in the last 5 months, without her quite deciding to, she'd stopped doing that. Not all the way. She still kept the account, would probably always keep the account. But the core of it, the fundamental posture of a person waiting to be left, had shifted. She stood on the foundation of the bakehouse one April evening after the crew had gone, in the last of the light, and looked at the tree line and the sheltered ground and the stone courses rising out of the earth, and she felt something she didn't entirely have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Something more structural than that. Something that had a foundation. The bakehouse was finished on a Saturday in late May. Clara knew it was finished not because anyone declared it so, but because she walked through it that morning before the crew arrived and there was nothing left to argue with. The stone foundation sat level and solid. The timber frame had dried true through April and showed no warping. The 2 ovens, built to her specifications, modified twice during construction because the first version of the flue draw wasn't right and she'd made them tear out the brickwork and redo it, sat side by side in the east wall, their mouths clean and waiting. The east-facing window she'd insisted on threw a panel of morning light across the stone floor that moved as the sun moved, which was exactly what she'd imagined when she'd drawn it. She stood in the middle of the floor and looked at all of it, and what she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of having made a thing that was right. Elias came in behind her. She heard his boots on the stone and didn't turn around. "Well," he said, "the second flue still pulls a little uneven." "I know. Dell says he can adjust the damper cap." "I know he can. I already talked to him about it." She finally turned. "It's good," she said, which was the most she could say without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. "It's a good building." He was watching her with the look she'd come to know best. The one that was mostly still, but with something underneath it that he didn't bother to hide from her anymore. "You drew every line of it," he said. "We drew it." "You drew it," he said again, firm and quiet. "I held things." She almost smiled. "You held things very well." He crossed the room and stood beside her, and they both looked at the ovens in the morning light, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now, specifically without anxiety, with something that felt like the opposite of the careful distance she'd maintained for so many years. Just this man, here, beside her, where he'd been placing himself steadily for 8 months without requiring anything back until she was ready. "I want to fire the first batch today," she said. "I figured you would. I want to do it alone." He nodded, no hesitation. "I'll be at the north pasture. Come find me when you're done." She did fire the first batch alone. She built the fire herself the way she always did, slow and patient, bringing the temperature up in stages, reading the draw from the flue, making the adjustments she'd already knew she'd need to make. She mixed the dough from a batch she'd prepared the night before and let it rest in the warmth while the oven came to temperature. And she shaped the loaves on the new stone work table and slid them in and closed the door and stood back. The oven did what a good oven did. It held the heat. It distributed it evenly across the dome. The bread baked the way bread baked when everything was right, the crust developing with that particular sound, a low crackle she could feel as much as hear, the smell filling the building until it was all there was. She pulled the first loaves out at noon and set them on the cooling rack she'd built along the south wall. And she stood there in her bakehouse, on her foundation, and let herself feel the full weight of where she was. She thought about the sod house on Callaway Road, the cracked store-bought stove, the 3 weeks of failed clay mixes before she got the first oven right. She thought about her father, who had thought she was competent, which was his highest compliment and which she understood now was more than most people got from him. She thought about the barn dance at 16 and the boy who had said what he'd said loud enough for 3 people to hear, and the long years of learning to take up less space, to want less, to arrange herself into a shape that didn't inconvenience anyone by existing hopefully. She thought about what it had cost to stand in a street in Harwick and say to James Pierce, I'm not interested in pretending. Not a lot, in the end. Less than she'd spent her whole life imagining it would cost. The bread cooled. The light moved across the stone floor. And Clara Ashcombe stood in the middle of what she'd built. In the middle of a life that had turned out to be larger than she'd permitted herself to plan for, and she allowed herself, quietly, without performing it for anyone, to be glad. She found Elias at the north pasture fence line, where he was doing what he always seemed to be doing when she found him unexpectedly. Something practical, in this case resetting a post that had leaned over the winter. He saw her coming across the field and stopped work and waited. She held out a loaf. The crust was still warm. He took it, broke off the end, ate it standing at the fence line with dirt on his gloves, and he closed his eyes for about 2 seconds, which was what he always did with her bread when it was exactly right. And then he looked at her. "Well," he said, same as that morning. "Both ovens even," she said. "The second flue still needs the damper cap, but it didn't affect the bake." "Good. I'm going to run 3 batches a day, starting Monday. I'll need 2 additional delivery runs per week. Wednesday and Saturday aren't enough for the full volume." He nodded. "Dell can do Mondays and Thursdays with the supply wagon. I'll need someone for Fridays eventually. We'll figure out Fridays." She looked at him. He looked at her. The pasture stretched out green behind him, the cattle somewhere further out, the sky enormous and pale, and the particular blue of a Nebraska late May that still surprised her with its generosity after the long gray of winter. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right." She'd been thinking about how to say this for 3 weeks, turning it over, looking for the version of it that didn't sound like fear or performance or either of the 2 things she'd spent her life confusing with something real. She hadn't found a clean version. She'd decided to say the unclear one. "I've been thinking about what you said," she started, "in February, about wanting to sit across from someone every day." He waited, holding the bread, watching her face. "I've been thinking about it," she said again, "and I keep running into the same problem, which is that I don't know how to do this." She gestured slightly at the air between them. "Without the account. I've kept the account for every single thing, and I know it drives you a little crazy, but I don't know how to let go of it because it's the only way I've known how to make sure I wasn't—" She stopped, looked down at the fence post, looked back up. "That I wasn't something that could be subtracted without the numbers changing." He was very still. "I need to know," she said, "that if this becomes whatever I think it's becoming, you're not going to decide at some point that the account doesn't balance, that I'm not enough, that the bread is great, but the woman who makes it is more than you signed up for." She got the last part out flat and plain, the way her father had taught her to say hard things, without flinching from them. "I need to know that." Elias set the bread down on the fence post. He pulled off one glove, then the other, and he crossed the distance between them. Not fast, not dramatic, just a man walking to where he needed to be. And he took her face in both hands, which he had never done before, and she felt the roughness of his palms and the specific warmth of them, and she did not pull back. "You are not a debt I'm tolerating," he said. "You are the reason I get up at 5 in the morning and find myself looking forward to the day." He said it quietly, directly into her eyes, without decoration. "You are more than I signed up for. You're right about that. What you've got wrong is that more than I signed up for is a complaint." He paused. "It's not a complaint, Clara." She breathed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not because the numbers balance, because I know who you are, and knowing who you are is not a thing I want to undo." She had kept herself together through harder things than this. She had rebuilt an oven from failed clay and driven through snowdrifts and told James Pierce to his face that she knew exactly what his problem was. She had made something out of the bare hard fact of a quarter section and a list of debts and a stubbornness she'd gotten from her difficult father. She did not keep herself together through this. Not completely. Not in the part of her face that she couldn't fully control, that went unsteady in a way she couldn't straighten out. She didn't cry exactly, but it was the closest she'd come in years, and he saw it and didn't look away and didn't make it into something to manage. "All right," she said, for what felt like the 100th time in 8 months. Her voice was rough at the edges. "All right." He held her face a moment longer, then let go, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and he picked up his bread and his gloves, and they walked back toward the bakehouse together across the May pasture, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. He asked her to marry him 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in June, at the kitchen table in the main house with a cup of coffee going cold between them and the ranch ledgers pushed aside and no particular ceremony to it. "I want to marry you," he said. "That's what I want. I'm not making a speech about it." She looked up from the cost projection she'd been working on. "No ring." "I thought you'd want to choose it." She considered this. "That's correct." She looked back down at the projection. "Yes." He blinked. "Yes, the ring, or yes, the—" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's it." "Did you want more?" "I thought there'd be conditions." "There are always conditions. You know what they are." She made a note in the margin. "You've known what they are for months." He leaned back in his chair, and she heard in his exhale the specific sound of a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a long time. "All right," he said, and she caught the echo of her own word in his mouth and didn't say anything about it, just let it sit there between them, the small shared language of two people who had learned each other. They were married in July at the county courthouse in Harwick, with Del Marsh and Martha Tillman as witnesses, which was not what Martha had hoped for in terms of ceremony, but which she accepted with grace because she understood, better than most, what the actual story was. The county clerk performed the service in 11 minutes and mispronounced Ashcombe on the first try, and Elias corrected him without embarrassment, and Clara signed the register as Clara Rowan and looked at the name for a moment before she capped the pen. It didn't feel like being absorbed. It felt like addition. She'd been afraid those two things would be indistinguishable, and they weren't. She could tell the difference, and the difference mattered. Martha cried a little outside the courthouse and claimed it was the dust. Del shook Elias's hand and then, after a moment's consideration, shook Clara's too, which she appreciated more than the flowers Ruth Denton had conspicuously not sent. The bakehouse was running at full capacity by August. 3 batches daily, 6 days a week, 2 full-time delivery routes, and a third partial one that Clara managed herself on Fridays. She'd hired 2 women from town, Iris, the young woman with the baby who had given her the nod at the milliner's, and a widow named Helen Brooke, who had been working at the hotel laundry for 2 years and was, it turned out, a better baker than she'd had any reason to tell anyone. Clara had found this out by accident when she'd handed Helen a problem batch one morning, and Helen had fixed it without being asked, instinctively adjusting the hydration the way you only could if you'd been baking seriously for years. "How long have you been doing this?" Clara said, watching her. "Since I was 8, Helen said, shaping the loaf with quick, efficient hands. "My mother ran a bakery in Ohio." "Why are you doing hotel laundry?" Helen looked at her. "Because nobody asked me to do anything else?" Clara looked back at the dough. "Well," she said, "I'm asking." Helen started the following Monday. The 3 of them found a rhythm in the bakehouse, the way people found rhythms when they were all good at a thing and didn't need to perform it. It wasn't frictionless. Clara had opinions about process that she expressed directly, and Helen had opinions of her own that she initially kept to herself, and then, once she understood that Clara actually wanted to hear them, offered with increasing confidence. Iris was quieter, but she was precise and reliable, and she brought her baby in the mornings and set him in a basket near the warm wall, and he slept through the early batches without complaint, which Clara took as a sign of good character. It was a strange and specific pleasure those mornings. The 4 of them, 3 women and 1 infant, in a stone building in the early light, the ovens going, the work moving in its rhythm, flour in the air, and the smell that Clara had lived inside for years now, like a second skin. She hadn't known she was lonely before she had this. She'd told herself she wasn't lonely. She'd believed it, more or less. She understood now that she'd been managing the loneliness so long it had started to feel like personality. Harwick changed its opinion of Clara Rowan the way towns change their minds about most things. Gradually, incompletely, and without fully acknowledging that any change had occurred. What happened, in practical terms, was that the bread became inescapable. The Double R camps had been talking about it all winter, and that word got around the ranching community, and by early fall of 1884, Clara had inquiries from 4 other ranch operations in the county. She handled these carefully. She was not going to overextend, was not going to sacrifice quality for volume, was not going to build something she couldn't sustain. and she took on 2 new contracts and held the others at the price of a commitment for next season. The women at the sewing circle, most of them, had been buying her bread since before any of this, and they'd never quite stopped. What they adjusted was the story they told themselves about who they'd been buying it from. The woman in the sod house on Callaway Road who they'd pitied had been replaced, in the social accounting, by Clara Rowan of the Double R Bakehouse, which was a different category of person and could be regarded with something closer to respect. Clara noticed this shift and found it both predictable and faintly irritating. She was the same person who'd been selling bread from a wagon for 2 years before any of this. The quality of the bread had not changed. What had changed was the address on the deed. She said as much to Elias one evening in September, sitting on the south step of the bakehouse, watching the last of the light go over the tree line. "People need a reason to rearrange what they think," he said. "The bread was always the reason. They just needed something to hang it on. They needed me to be attached to a man with a name they recognized." Partly. He said it without flinching, which she appreciated because it was true. But partly they needed you to stay. She looked at him. "You weren't going anywhere," he said. "But they didn't know that. When you built on the land, it told them you weren't going anywhere. That's different from a woman selling bread from a wagon." He turned over the coffee cup in his hands. "Permanence reads differently to people, especially out here." She thought about that. "I was permanent before." "I know. They didn't see it." She sat with that for a moment. The unfairness of it was real. She'd been permanent in that sod house for 2 years, had dug in and held on through a hard winter and a harder summer, and had not once considered leaving. The fact that it had taken a stone foundation and a name change for the county to register her permanence was a fact that sat in her with some bitterness, and she didn't try to dissolve the bitterness because it was earned. But she also thought about Iris, who was feeding her baby, and talking to Helen about dough ratios at 7 in the morning, 3 days a week. She thought about Helen, who had been doing hotel laundry for 2 years because nobody had asked her to do anything else. She thought about Martha Tillman, who had said you could let yourself be a little bit glad about it. Clara, with the messily sincere kindness of a woman who saw more than she was always credited for. The world was not just made of James Pierces and Ruth Dentons. It was also made of people who didn't know what they were looking at until someone showed them, and who were capable, once shown, of adjusting. She wasn't sure when she'd started believing that. Sometime in the last year. She hadn't noticed it arriving. Mahad. The thing with James Pierce resolved itself that October, not through confrontation but through the specific social mechanism of a man being publicly wrong about something he'd been publicly certain about. Pierce had been running a land claim on the eastern edge of the county that he'd been using for 2 years as if the title was clear. It wasn't. The title dispute had been quietly working its way through the county land office since 1881, and in October of 1884 it came out into the open when the original claimant, a family who'd left during the drought of '79 and come back, filed a formal complaint. The case was straightforward, but Pierce had allies, and for about 3 weeks it looked like he might pressure the land office into sitting on it. Elias was not directly involved, except that he knew the county land agent personally, had worked with him on the water rights dispute, and had a precise and detailed opinion about the Pierce claim that he delivered in writing to the land office in a letter that was, by all accounts, civil and specific, and left no room for interpretation. Clara found out about the letter from Dell, who had helped write it. "He didn't tell me," she said. Dell shrugged. "He said it wasn't related to you. He said Pierce had been running a bad claim since before you were involved, and it needed to be on the record." She looked at him. "That's all he said." More or less. Dell had the expression of a man deciding how much was enough. He also said that men who use position to make other people feel small about things that aren't any of their business ought to be dealt with on the things that are. She sat with that. The Pierce claim was voided in November. Pierce was not ruined by it. He had other land, other resources. But he was publicly wrong in a county where he'd spent years being publicly certain, and that had a particular kind of weight. He stopped coming to the feed store on Saturdays. He stopped, as far as Clara could tell, saying things about her at all. She didn't celebrate it. It wasn't that kind of resolution. What she felt was closer to the feeling she got when a structural problem in the bakehouse got properly fixed. Not pleasure exactly, more the absence of a thing that had been there, creating friction, and now wasn't. She thanked Elias for the letter. He said it had nothing to do with her. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you." He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at her when she'd said something he was going to keep. Then he went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she went back to the bakehouse, and that was that. Seb. The winter of 1884 was gentler than the previous one, which Clara did not trust and prepared for anyway, because the plains had taught her that gentleness was not a promise. She had her firewood in by October, the bakehouse fully insulated, the supply contracts renegotiated with better terms now that she had a year of delivery history to argue from. Elias had repaired and expanded the main house kitchen over the summer. Not for her sake, he said, but because the previous kitchen had been inadequate for years, and he'd been putting it off. And she had a real kitchen now, with proper shelving and a good stove and a window that faced east the way she'd always wanted a kitchen window to face. She cooked in it in the evenings after the bakehouse was done for the day, which was not the same thing as baking for the market. This was cooking for the two of them, and sometimes for Dell and a couple of the hands who ate at the main house on Fridays, and it was a different kind of work, looser, more improvisational, less concerned with precision. She was not, it turned out, as good a cook as she was a baker. She burned things. She seasoned unevenly. She made a soup in November that Elias ate without complaint, but that she could tell was not quite right, and she spent 3 days figuring out what she'd done wrong before she tried it again. He ate both versions without complaint, and when she asked which was better, he gave her an honest answer, which was the correct response, and also the one she'd known he'd give, which was part of why she'd asked. "You could just let it go," he said, about the soup. "It wasn't bad. It should have been better. Not everything has to be what it should be. Sometimes it just has to be good enough." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "You didn't marry me because I was good enough." He thought about that for a moment. "No," he said, "but I also didn't marry you because you were perfect. I know that. I married you because you're the most honest person I've ever met," he said, "including with yourself. That's not common." He picked up his coffee. The soup was fine. She made the soup again the following week, and it was better. She would not have been able to explain why this mattered so much except that it did. The way all the things she built with her hands mattered, not as proof of anything to anyone else, but because there was a standard she carried inside herself that had nothing to do with what other people saw. Her father had called it competence. She had another name for it now. She wasn't sure what the name was exactly, but it lived in the same place that had made her build the oven in the first place, the place that said, if this is going to be done, it should be done right. Spring came the way it always came to the plains, less like an arrival and more like a slow argument the land was having with itself, gray to brown to the particular exhausted green of March. And then suddenly, without announcement, the full green of May and the prairie doing what it did when it was allowed to, which was to be staggering in a way that you forgot about every winter, and then remembered all at once. Clara was 30 in April of 1886. She didn't make much of it. Elias made more of it than she did. He arranged for Dell and Helen and Iris and the baby, who was walking now and had opinions about bread, to come for supper, and he had ordered something from St. Louis that arrived 2 days before her birthday, and sat on the kitchen shelf wrapped in brown paper, and she did not look at it until he told her to. It was a scale, a proper baker's scale, brass and precise, with a full set of calibrated weights. The kind of scale she'd been making do without for 2 years, estimating by hand and eye, getting it right most of the time, but never quite as right as this would allow. She stood at the kitchen counter with the scale in both hands and felt something crack open in her chest in the good way, the way that only happened when a person gave you something that showed they'd been paying attention. "You mentioned it," he said from the doorway, "in the first month, when you were explaining the oven. You said a proper scale would let you control the hydration better. You remembered that." "I wrote it down," he said, matter of fact. She looked at him. "You wrote it down." "I was writing things down in October, things you said that I didn't want to forget." He shrugged, slight and a little self-conscious. The book was on the list. The scale was on the list. She thought about October, when she'd been telling herself his visits were about a bread contract. While she'd been carefully constructing reasons why this wasn't what it looked like, he'd been sitting somewhere writing down things she said so he wouldn't forget them. She put the scale on the counter and crossed the kitchen and she kissed him, which was not something she'd ever initiated, and she felt him go still for a second, surprised, before he settled into it, and she thought, This is what it looks like when you stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing. It had taken her 30 years to understand the difference. She was not going to spend time grieving the 30 years. The bakehouse added a third oven that summer. Helen took on a larger role in the daily operations, which freed Clara to manage the business side more fully. The contracts, the pricing, the ongoing negotiation with supply merchants that she'd gotten considerably better at over 2 years of practice. She had a ledger now that was genuinely complex, multiple income streams, a payroll for 3 women, a delivery schedule that required coordination with the ranch wagon operation. She went over it every Sunday evening at the kitchen table, and she never once thought of outsourcing the accounting to anyone else, because the numbers were hers and she knew every line of them, and that was not a thing she was willing to give away. Elias reviewed the ranch ledgers at the same table on Sunday evenings, and they worked in parallel, occasionally asking each other questions that crossed the line between their respective operations in the way that things inevitably crossed when 2 people shared a life. She had opinions about his hay contracts. He had opinions about her flour supplier. Neither of them took the other's opinions personally, which was its own kind of achievement and one they'd had to work at. They argued sometimes. Real arguments, not performances. About money, about decisions, about the one time he made a commitment on behalf of the bakehouse operation without asking her first, and she said what she thought about that in terms that left no ambiguity. He had acknowledged he was wrong, not immediately, but after a night and a morning, which was about how long it took him to move from defending himself to being honest about it. She respected that. She'd known men who never got there at all. She was not easy to live with. She knew this. She had edges that didn't soften all the way, habits of self-sufficiency that sometimes read as distance, a tendency to go silent when she was working something out that she'd been told, by Elias, felt like a wall going up. She was working on it. She wasn't there yet. It was possible she wouldn't ever be entirely there. He was not easy to live with either. He was stubborn in a way that was architectural. It went all the way down. And he had a capacity for silence that was different from hers. Not the silence of someone working something out, but the silence of someone who had decided something and considered it closed. She'd learned to push against that silence, to ask the direct question, because he would answer a direct question honestly, even when the honest answer was uncomfortable. That had taken her about 6 months to figure out, and another 6 months to trust. They were, in summary, 2 imperfect people who had decided each other was worth the difficulty, which was, as far as Clara could tell, the best definition of a working marriage she'd encountered. Iris's husband left in the fall of 1886. It happened the way those things happened. First the distance, then the silence. Then one morning a wagon going east on the Callaway Road with what looked like everything that mattered loaded into it. Iris came to work that Monday morning with her boy on her hip and a face that was composed in the specific way of a woman who had cried everything out the night before and was now operating on whatever came after. Clara didn't say anything about it at first. She let Iris work, let the rhythm of the morning do what it did, and watched. By mid-morning, Iris had been precise and efficient and hadn't said a word that wasn't about dough. "You can talk about it," Clara said finally. "Or not. Either way." Iris shaped a loaf with quick, mechanical hands. "There's nothing to say that makes it better." "No," Clara agreed. "There usually isn't." A long silence. The ovens worked. The baby slept in his basket. "Did you ever think," Iris said carefully, "that you were going to be alone for the rest of your life? Like, not as a fear, as a fact. Like you'd just accepted it?" Clara looked at her. "Yes." "How did you stop?" "I didn't stop accepting it," Clara said. "I just stopped requiring it. There's a difference." She thought about how to say the next part, which she'd never put into words before because she'd never had anyone to say it to. "For a long time I thought being alone was just what I deserved. Like there was an accounting, and the numbers came out that way, and that was the answer." She looked at the loaf she was shaping. "What I had wrong was who was doing the accounting." Iris was quiet. "You didn't fail at anything," Clara said. "A man leaving is not a verdict on you." "People will say it is." "People say a lot of things." Clara slid a loaf into the oven. "Most of it is just them trying to make sense of things they don't understand by putting the shape of it onto whoever's closest." She closed the oven door. "You're good at this work. You've got your boy. You've got a wage and a place to come every morning. She looked at Iris directly. That's not nothing. That's actually considerable. Iris looked at the baby in the basket for a long moment. Then she nodded, just slightly, and went back to work. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't going to be fixed by one conversation on a Monday morning in a bakehouse. But Clara had learned slowly that sometimes what a person needed was not repair but company. Someone standing beside them in the difficulty who wasn't going to flinch from the truth of it. She could do that. She'd had practice, mostly by being on the receiving end. She thought about what Elias had said in February, 2 years earlier, the cold morning in her sod house kitchen. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you to let me be here while you are. She'd thought at the time that she didn't know what to do with that. She knew now. You passed it on when you could. The years laid themselves down the way years did on the plains. Some of them hard, some easier. None of them exactly what you'd planned for. There was a drought summer that tested everything, the bread operation and the ranch both, and they made it through by cutting where they could and not cutting where they couldn't. And by the end of that season, they'd learned what the non-negotiables were, which was useful information to have. There was a good year after the drought, when everything seemed abundant in the specific, generous way of things that had been scarce. And Clara expanded the contracts and hired a third woman in the bakehouse and paid Helen a proper wage increase that she'd been owed for a year. There was a child, eventually. A boy, born in the spring of 1888, who arrived into the world with some difficulty and considerable noise, and who looked in those early weeks mostly like a very strong opinion about discomfort. He was named Thomas, after Clara's father, which had been her idea, and Elias had agreed without asking why, and she thought he understood without being told. She did not become a different person because she had a child. She'd worried about that, in the months before, that she was supposed to transform into something softer, more available, that motherhood would require her to put down the parts of herself she'd spent years building. It didn't. She was who she was, methodical, direct, hard in the way her father had been hard, better at building things than at talking about feelings, still keeping the account even though she'd long since stopped needing it to feel safe. What she was, that hadn't been there before, was patient in a way she hadn't known she was capable of. Thomas did not operate on schedules. Thomas did not respond to logic. Thomas required a form of attention that was not problem-solving, but something more like presence, simple and continuous. And she found she had it in her, that presence, in a way that surprised her. Elias was better at the soft parts than she was, which she had not predicted and which she registered without jealousy. He could sit with the boy through the bad nights in a way that was easier for him than for her, and she didn't pretend otherwise, and he didn't pretend she wasn't better at the parts that required them to make decisions. They divided things the way they'd divided everything. Not neatly, not always fairly, but honestly. On an evening in the fall of 1889, Clara stood in the bakehouse after everyone had gone home, the last batch cooling on the racks, the ovens banking down for the night. She did this sometimes, stayed after, not to work, just to be in the space. It was a habit she'd had since the first oven in the sod house. This quality of stillness at the end of the day when the work was done and the building was quiet and warm. Thomas was 7 now and at the main house with Elias, probably fighting about bedtime with the specific tenacity he brought to all arguments, which he had gotten from her and which she could not in good conscience criticize. Helen had locked up the supply room. Iris, whose boy was 5 and running around the ranch yard with a freedom she encouraged, had driven home 2 hours ago. The delivery routes had been run. The accounts were balanced. The bread was as good as she knew how to make it, which, after 7 years, was considerably good. She thought about the sod house. She still owned it. The quarter section was in her name, had always been in her name, and she'd kept it for reasons she hadn't examined too closely for a long time. She'd leased the land to a young couple this past spring, kept the house in repair, driven out there twice a year to check on things. The clay oven was still there. The couple had been using it. She thought about 24 years old and the barn dance and the long years of deciding to want less. She thought about Elias in the street in Harwick, eating the end of a loaf with a focus that had nothing to do with performance. She thought about the letter on the fence line, the snowed-in Wednesday, the engineering book in green cloth. I find myself interested in talking to you. She thought about what she would say to the woman she'd been at 24, if she could. She didn't think she'd say it gets better because that was too simple, and also she wasn't sure it was what that woman needed to hear. What she'd needed to hear was not a promise about the future. What she'd needed was someone to say, the accounting you're doing is wrong. You are not the sum of what other people have decided to notice about you. She hadn't been able to hear it at 24. She'd needed to work her way to it, through the oven and the winter and the engineering book and the man who came back every Wednesday and wrote things down. You couldn't shortcut your way to knowing something like that. You had to earn it the long way. Through the bakehouse window, she could see the main house lights, warm and specific against the early dark. The tree line was black against a sky going from orange to deep blue, the last edge of the sun somewhere behind the western grass. The cattle were settled. The prairie was doing its enormous quiet thing, which it had been doing since before any of them were here, and would keep doing long after, indifferent and magnificent, the backdrop to every small and human thing. She had built a life in the middle of all that indifference, built it with her own hands, out of clay and stubbornness, and eventually, when she'd finally believed she was allowed, love. It wasn't a perfect life. The drought years had been genuinely hard. The argument about the supply contract in 1887 had lasted 4 days and said things that both of them still remembered. Thomas was going to be a difficult child for some years yet. She could see it coming, and she was not going to be a perfect mother any more than she'd been a perfect wife or a perfect baker. Though she would continue to hold herself to the standard she held everything to, which was, if this is going to be done, do it right. But it was hers. All of it. The bakehouse and the foundation and the ledger and the hard conversations and the Sunday evenings at the kitchen table and the man who had come back every Wednesday for 8 months because he wanted to know her and had written down the things she said so he wouldn't forget them. Hers. She locked the bakehouse and walked across the yard toward the house lights. And halfway there, she heard Thomas's voice through the window, some argument about bedtime, running right on schedule. And she felt the thing she'd felt the day she stood in the finished bakehouse in May, the thing she hadn't quite had a word for. She had a word for it now. Home. That was all it was, and it was everything. She walked toward the light,